Side 3.
Like that can get out before Craig or I could have, stood up or done anything about it. So that would have been the wrong thing for him. But what to call him, because he also needed some treatment and he needed to be accountable for this impulsive act. So I had the term abuse reactive child available to me, and it was particularly important to me to be able to talk about Ed in that way. Now, one of the reasons why I tell the story in such detail is the therapist who had terminated with him for noncompliance wrote a letter to all the different referral sources that this had been sent to, saying that Ed was a sexual psychopath and that he needed incarceration and whatever. Now, I think that what often happens with kids like Ed is that this behavior then is used retroactively to justify treatment failures. Look at this kid. This kid was so bad. No wonder it didn't work. Look at the depths of pathology, and they end up getting quite scapegoated for these kinds of behaviors. So let's talk a little bit about what the characteristics are of this kind of abuse reactive behavior. With, again, as I said, with Ed, this was very impulsive behavior, and he didn't ask anybody to keep it a secret. This is pretty much Freud's repetition compulsion. Kids who engage in abuse reactive behavior are generally splitting the world through some kind of trauma, hands-on or hands-off, but they've had some level of it, and they have split the world between victims and offenders. You're either one or the other. You either do the dumping or you get dumped on. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to take questions. I am. Yeah. That you either do the dumping or you get dumped on. And so when they cannot stand to stay on the victim side of the equation any longer, the kid with abuse reactive behavior may go to the other side and experiment. Why does this person do this so much? They take a chance on getting caught. Kids know that folks who abuse them feel better afterwards, that it offers some kind of relief to the person. So what is this all about? So he had done that impulsive kind of acting out, going to the offender side. They very often will do what got done to them in a fairly pure form. So when I interviewed Ed, he talked about one of the sex offenders in his life had said, "Do you want to see my finger grow?" Now, usually with these kids, the trauma is ongoing or fairly recent, and reactive is the key word here. This is really what we want to pay attention to. These are kids who show us rather than tell us what has happened to them in their lives. Now, you might be saying, well, gee, if time is a differential here, if it has to be sort of fairly recent and this is reactive, you're telling me Ed was in a good home for 2 years, so what gives? Well, actually, at school, one of the sex offenders in his life, who was a distant relative, was actually working around the school. And that really kept all of this very fresh and very alive for Ed. He also didn't have places that he was talking about this. So in a way, it really was ongoing trauma for him. These are kids who still find this behavior to be ego-dystonic, and this is critical, ego-dystonic. That when I ask them, how did you feel after the incident? How did you feel immediately after? These are the kids who say to me, stupid, guilty, I hated myself, I wished I could hit rewind and erase it. I remembered what that was like for me. I didn't want to do it to somebody else. I felt terrible about what I did. And this was an adjustment for me because I was used to, by the time I worked with these kids, I'd already had 6 or 7 years of the older kids, that when I said, how did you feel immediately after the incident, they'd say, fine, better, good. What a stupid question. Why would I do it if it didn't make me feel better? So to deal with the level of a very genuine ego-dystonic affect was really a shock for me. I wasn't used to it. The difference being, I think, is that many of the older kids I was working with had used many years and time and peer influence and increased cognitive abilities. We lay those neurons down till we're 14 to be able to build up defenses. They had brick walls between them and their victimization. They had brick walls between them and their hurt. So I was used to having made many mistakes of crashing through those brick walls. I was used to respecting them, believing they were there for a reason, and working on the here and now, the problem behavior that had gotten them into trouble, and then slowly but surely working backwards towards victimization. If one believes that their victimization either didn't happen, didn't bother them, was no big deal, you can see how that would be a license then to go do it to other people. Because, hey, victimization, it's of no consequence, right? No big deal. For the abuse-reactive child, see, I told you I was going to make that mistake. For the child with abuse-reactive behavior, it is a big deal, and they are not well defended around it. So that if we can keep them safe, if we can protect them, they generally will tell us that they have a secret, or that it's uncomfortable to be with people to be treated differently than other people in their family are being treated, or that this is a burden in some way. Along with it being so ego-dystonic, the kids talk about it being a not me experience. They'll say, look, lady, trust me. I didn't wake up in the morning with an erection, or if it's a girl, the hands, heart down to the genitals, or tingling sensation. No, I never thought about doing this before. When I think about it, since I feel awful, or I don't think about it, I certainly don't touch myself if it comes into my mind sense. I don't do that. Trust me, I walked into the bathroom, there was a bare buttocks, I was minding my own business, it just happened. Now again, when they say not me, I don't think they're talking about anything like amnesia or psychogenic fugue, or I don't even think there's much of an element of dissociation involved in these kinds of behaviors. But it's not who they want to be. It is really so ego-dystonic for them. Because they aren't well defended, what we are able to do is two paths of treatment simultaneously. And this is pretty much the standard nowadays. In your bibliography, there's a book called When Children Abuse by Cunningham and McFarlane. And I'd highly recommend that to you. What we do with this type of behavior is short-term group. I cannot stress short-term enough. So no less than 8, probably no more than 16 or 20 weeks. And we talk about this as a class for people who use their hands instead of their words. And what we're going to teach you to do today is use your words. You know, it's okay for you to be mad, bad, glad, or sad, but when you feel mad, bad, glad, or sad, you can't be exposing yourself to people. You can't be touching them. You can't be making these phone calls anymore. There are other things you can do. And so in the group modality, we do a lot of the teaching, where did you learn it, and what are you going to do instead. However, you do have an opportunity here in individual therapy to work on victimization issues, to do what we know to do. I'm sorry that happened to you. I believe you. Through play or drawing or talk, to take them from victim to victor, to do what Ethan Pinos call developing an internal plan of action, to have the story end differently in some way for them. So you can do that in individual treatment while you have them in the group. Now you might say, well, why don't you just do both in individual treatment? I think that these kids feel more guilt than shame, but nonetheless, it's still useful at times for them to have other people that have made the same mistakes with them. And if you were in a situation like in Ed's case, if we had had a group we could put him in, we would have. But he was in a remote rural area. There was no group. So they ended up doing a dyad with him. He and another kid with similar issues learned about why you don't do this kind of behavior and what to do instead. When I think about this group, but also this end of the continuum, it reminds me of a story. I'm not sure if it's Sufi or Hindu, but I remember a young man that I hired at an outpatient clinic got the job because of this story. I was asking him about his style of working with kids, and he was a brand new like MA psychologist. And he said he thinks about this story where this wind and the sun have a debate with each other. They get into a fight with each other about who is the strongest. And they see a person walking on earth with a really big down quilted coat on. And they say, whoever can get that person to take that coat off, that will be the strongest. So the wind insists on going first, and the wind blows and blows and blows and blows and blows. And of course, the harder the wind blows, the more that person holds on to that coat. Finally, the wind exhausts itself, and so it's the sun's turn. It comes out, shines brightly, and within a few minutes, the person takes the coat off. And so the sun wins the debate. This is the end of the continuum where we need a whole lot of sun, and we want to work more on rewarding them for using other behaviors. We want to work more on redirection than we want to be consequencing negative behaviors. You may need to do a little bit of that, but the focus really needs to be on the rewarding the use of other kinds of behaviors that you're teaching. And I'm going to show you some workbook exercise and that kind of thing in the afternoon. A couple of things I want to highlight here is one is the prominence of post-traumatic stress disorder in this population, and it's something to really be wary of. I remember one young man taught me a tremendous amount. He told me that he was racked with the intrusive recollections of his own abuse, and that this metaphor I use with the kids is that it's like having a VCR in your head. Somebody puts a tape in, hits play, and then rewind and play and rewind and play, and you see the same scene over and over and over again. So he had these flashbacks of his own sexual victimization. This went on for years. Like Ed, he had no one he could talk with about it. So he ended up around 9 or 10 years old, no longer wanting to feel helpless. He said to himself, well, let's see if I can make something good out of something that's bad. This is a sexual scene. It's not going to go away. What if I masturbate to the intrusive recollection? What if I make it into a sexual fantasy instead of a flashback? Now, he's not using all this language, but it was really his way of trying to master what was very intrusive and out of control for him. Now, we didn't get to see this young man till he was 13, and by that time he had an entrenched pattern. So the kinds of recollections that are going on for these kids are really something that we need to pay attention to. It's another argument for the parallel paths of doing the victim work in individual therapy and the class for people who use their hands instead of their words in the group or class setting. We also really stress with these kids that you can be a good person with bad behavior. I don't think all of these kids need to be removed from their living situations. Some of them can live with increased structure. They need a lot of help, they need a lot of support, but they don't all need to go to residential treatment. And again, if they're in groups that go on and on and on that are open-ended, what may end up happening for them is they become over-identified with this behavior. And there's real cost to over-treating this particular kind of phenomenon. The other thing we have to remember is that we can cause abuse-reactive behavior. Okay, it always gets traced back to the family, to the environment. But if you're working, and several of you are, in alternative care, in milieu, you're in a day treatment program, you're in a self-contained SPED classroom that's got a lot of therapeutic components to it, you're working resi or hospitals, we can cause this to happen in kids who did not have these issues before. I'll give you an example. I consult to a place I like very much. They have a central school and a gazillion cottages all over the place. And all the kids come into the one school. All of a sudden, we start having this rash of sexual acting out. I mean, out of nowhere. One kid goes down to Dunkin' Donuts and drops his trousers. Another one is calling 900 Spank Me. Another one has ordered lingerie from Victoria's Secret and given it to his favorite female residential care worker. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And we're a little slow because it takes us a long time to figure out that even though these are at different cottages, these kids are in the same classroom. Okay, and these are small classrooms. There are about 6 kids to a classroom. So what they end up, we figure this out finally, and then we begin to look into it. The female teacher in that classroom was dating one of the 14-year-old boys on the weekends, on his home visits. Now, allegedly, it hadn't been sexual. I really have severe doubts about this, but at any rate, it supposedly hadn't been. But the other kids were aware of it, and they were all dressed up with no place to go. And they ended up with this kind of behavior. And, people start, again, dragging their families through the mud. Well, guess what? That was our fault. Okay, we caused the abuse reactive behavior in this case. So, and I think on a lower level, that's a pretty extreme example, although not uncommon. But I think that even, we often date where we work. People do that at Bell Atlantic. They do it at Filene's Basement. If you're in the human services industry, we date each other as well. We need to be really careful, though, I think, working with traumatized kids around boundaries, our relationships, what they know, what they don't know. And we should definitely err on the side of caution, because that in and of itself would be, it could, for some kids who are more vulnerable due to history, more vulnerable due to some of their cognitive issues, could be overstimulating. Okay, so questions at this point. Jack, did you want? It's nice to see you. But you need to. Yeah, you really have to. Sorry.
For the 12-year-old, when it was reported, the therapist sent out a letter.
Yeah.
Did this letter go to the managing agency?
Yeah.
And what happened?
Well, I went ballistic, is what happened. Because it was such a unfair thing, and he'd been one of the things I wanted him. I wanted him psych tested, and not just with projectives and with the intellectual test, but I also wanted a really good battery of neuropsych testing on him, because he had been such a headbanger. That had been one of his symptoms. And there was a spaciness that I was still trying to figure out whether that was more dissociation or what was going on. So what ended up happening is, I responded to the label. He did stay in that home.
Did you stay in the home?
Yeah, he stayed in the home. He did do the dyad, which was kind of tough due to attendance. He got a different individual therapist. And one of the things that we were really able to work on was that his family, the two parents that he'd been placed with, were very oriented to feelings and affect, and wanted to talk about how they were feeling and how he was feeling, and wanted this level of communication that for Ed was part of the problem, not the solution. So they actually, I think the most effective intervention in all of this was the family therapy. So as far as I know, he's still there, and he's a young, well, he's, but he remained part of that family through independence. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Other questions about abuse reactive behavior? This is really where we have the most hope. This is early intervention. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about where psychiatric disorders and that realm would fall on this continuum of care or continuum of behavior. I think about a particular child that I worked with about 8 months ago. I worked with him for about a period of 2 years, who could fall into any one of those categories. We had about 8 different Axis 1 diagnoses for this kid, including fetishism, OCD, PTSD, depression. He ran the whole gamut, and he also had auditory hallucinations. He had extreme fantasy life that anything could trigger, from a pantyhose commercial to a freckle on your toe. And he was extremely disturbed, and I can't figure out how to work in that whole psychological dysfunction, and when somebody has hallucinations and real psychiatric problems, where that falls in terms of treating the behavior.
It's an excellent question. One thing you've done is you've reminded us that these are not discrete categories, so that's very useful. A person can have 1 foot in one and a foot in the other one. It's also not a linear path here. You don't start and keep going. A lot of people stop at different points. With the young person you're describing, there's a lot of differential diagnosis issues, and one is folks with OCD, even OCD with the sexual loop. They do experience a voice telling them to do those things. So is that not oriented to time, place, or person? Is it part of the OCD? It's a good example of where psychopharm can be your friend, and where with a kid like that, you really want to begin to work with the psychopharm as one of the first lines of defense. I'm actually going to come back to that when we talk about compulsion. So if you don't get the answer you're looking for, then bring it up again. But it's a very interesting case where everybody's all over the the map, and I would look at both biology. I'd want a good endocrinological workup on a kid like this.
We did that as well.
Good. Okay. And did that yield anything?
This child actually had a parent who had neurofibromatosis.
Yes.
He actually did not have any trait of that, although his biological brother did. But he had been diagnosed with a, what was the name of it now? Like a water on the brain type of, I can't remember the exact name of the diagnosis. But that sort of, and he was very cognitively limited as well.
Okay. All right. And we're going to, as particularly as we do the afternoon, talk about working with developmental disabilities and cognitive limitations. Now, I just mentioned that that a lot of people do self-correct, and I think this is an important point. Well, how do we know that? How do we know that some people experiment with this a few times, find it so ego-dystonic for themselves that they stop? And well, one is, it's anecdotal. A lot of folks doing this work who have private practices have had the experience, I have too, of adults coming in saying 20, 30, 40 years ago, I molested my younger brothers or sisters, my cousins on a camping trip, a kid I was taking care of. Help me. I want to make amends. How do I talk about this with them, with their family? I've never forgotten it. You know, these talk shows, they say that you're going to do this again. I'm a human time bomb waiting to go off, so what if I haven't done it for 20 or 30 years? It doesn't matter. And for some people, they are able to stop. For some, without intervention, if they're not like Ed and they're lucky and they get caught, it will continue. And in this way, we do have somewhat of a linear path from abuse reactive to the next category, which is the compulsivity. And that is I think that this is compulsivity, or this next stage is where the pleasure principle really begins to kick in. Because I think what happens is the kids begin to think, how could something so bad feel so good? If it were really that bad, it wouldn't feel this good. And if it were all as bad as I'm making it out to be, why isn't anyone telling me to stop it? Why haven't I gotten caught? Why haven't I gotten beaten down for doing this? Maybe that's because it's not so bad after all. And with some of the kids I work with, again, I worry less about the physical and sexual abuse. I worry more about neglect. Now, neglect may be neglect of attention and affection and daily survival needs, but I also think a huge part of neglect is neglect of optimal frustration. Neglect of natural consequences for your behavior. A lot of kids today, they're being neglected in that they don't get it where they stop and somebody else begins. I go back to the school bus experience, you know, that they aren't entitled to take from other people just because they desperately want something and they're empty and need to be filled up, or angry and need to be soothed. That's not okay, and that there are natural consequences for those kinds of behaviors. And I think for some kids, that is the core of their neglect experience. And if it's severe, then we're going to be moving down to the other end of the continuum. Yes? Do you want to go ahead? This will be the last question, then I want to finish up on the compulsivity. Okay.
I'm not sure it's a question. I've seen a couple of kids that were brought in with the question of have they been sexually abused because they were they were both in foster care, coming from a very neglected background. And one little girl, when she was very stressed out, would begin to mimic coitus with a teddy bear, or sometimes with other children. And I saw her for quite a while, and finally she was able to say that she had, when she was with her mother, she slept in the same bed. Her mother was making love to people. She saw it. She saw how her mother enjoyed it. And when she was very stressed out, she wanted to be close to her mother, and she'd start with a pillow or whatever.
Right.
And I think I've seen other kids in foster care with this. A little boy who began to unbuckle his foster father's pants, and everyone, he was only 3, you know. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted, I'm not sure that this little girl had been abused. I think the problem was she'd been neglected and overstimulated, lived with no boundaries, and didn't know how else to handle.
Right, and the abuse reactive, it's, you know, my colleague Kevin Creedon, and I actually should have this changed, it calls it now trauma reactive behavior. And I think it's a useful switch in the language, because the example you're giving is what she was being reactive to was the overstimulation. So it's a good way of looking at the framework of hands-on versus hands-off. And if we don't think hands-on abuse, then definitely that would do it. That would account for it. She has more than enough to help us understand where she learned that behavior. And there's a real object relations piece in what you're describing as well. Yeah, it worked to soothe anxiety or to lift her out of depression. Also made her like her mother at a time when that's developmentally usual and expected. Now for some of us, we can't get out of the house in high heels if our kids are in sneakers. We've got to wear our sneakers and then change later. She had a slightly different role model than, I want to be like my mother and wear the same clothes and wear the same shoes and wear the same makeup if you wear it. So there's a really important object relations piece as well, which actually I do want to get to. So thank you. Okay, now on this issue of moving down the line here, the compulsivity, and I would suggest to you, these are the kids that make us crazy. These are the hardest management issues. They're the toughest differential diagnosis. It's like where do you start? And they're the ones that, from the standpoint of countertransference, really stir us up the most, because they're very, very likable, and yet they can do such nasty, nasty things. So what we're talking about here at the issue of compulsivity is that the child has become one-dimensional. Sexual behavior now meets all needs. It meets needs for attachment. This is how they're close to people. This is how they experience, through the time and practice that they've had, it's how they experience relationship. Now, these are the kids that very quickly will ask us, are you gay? Are you straight? Are you single? Do you have a partner? Do you have children? Did you have a vaginal birth or cesarean section? How was labor for you? If you're a man, they talk to your groin. If you're a woman, they talk to your breasts. It's basically, like that. Now, I'll give you a subtler story. About 4 or 5 years ago, I started a group, and it was with kids that had this level of compulsivity. So they were talking about more entrenched pattern. So this young man was 14 at the time. He had been interviewed by me twice, so I had 2 screening interviews. First group, at the end of the first group, he says to me, "Excuse me, ma'am, I really think you should do something about your hair." Now, I hate being called ma'am. I hate it. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he says, it's all that gray in it. It makes you look older than you really are. Now, of course, there's all these landmines here, because I'm just dying to ask, well, how old do you think I look? But, and I'm sort of like trying to follow along here. And I finally kind of figured it out. And I said, do you mean like this here? Because my ends had grown out. Is this what you're talking about? And he said, yes, it makes you look older than you really are. I felt like saying, no, honey, this costs $100 here. I've just been a little short on cash lately. I mean, don't you know I went and got it colored the next week. But borrowed money from my friends. But and I also, understood from the transference point of view that he was trying to figure out, was I going to stick around? If he's going to tell me the most shameful things about himself, am I going to die on him? How old am I? I mean, what does this, it's actually baby blonde. What does it mean? That kind of thing. But the other part of it in terms of the compulsivity, think about a 14-year-old boy discussing hair color with a middle-aged woman. How often does that happen? Yet relating to us around our bodies, around physical traits, around our being, is how they relate. Okay, so Tony's contribution here is calling this extensive mutual sexual behavior. Extensive mutual sexual behavior. If reactive was the key word in abuse reactive, extensive is the key word here. Extensive really is what we're talking about. And what they do prefer is to have consenting partners. They really prefer to have somebody who's got the same itch to scratch, and these kids find them easily. So the sexual behavior is something they're good at. It meets needs of mastery and competence. They can figure out who's got the same itch to scratch. It's like that song from South Pacific, Some Enchanted Evening. Their eyes meet across a crowded room, they know. They're good at getting access to each other. They're good at keeping the secret. They're good at avoiding consequences. all of this kind of thing. This is sounding like vaguely familiar to people who've been reading the news lately. And then there are, it meets needs of identity. Okay, so it's I'm not a fighter, I'm a lover. If you were born to run, you're going to drive your car around the New Jersey Turnpike a lot. If you're born to have sex, you're going to be looking for people to have sex with. And then finally, it is biologically very reinforcing. It makes them feel alive. It makes them come out of the depression. It calms anxiety. It does something on a physiological level that is crucial to their sense of their own well-being. And it's long-standing. We're talking about time and practice here. Now, one example we could talk about is sibling incest, where the two siblings are very close in age. Sibling incest where there's a level playing field. Both of them know about what the sexual activity is about. Both know what the consequences are going to be. One is not taking advantage of another's physical disability, intellectual disability, emotional difficulties. One is not the surrogate parent for the other. Often, to me, this is an indicator of neglect because there's no one watching the kids. The parents may be preoccupied with mental illness or substance abuse or crime or family of origin issues or whatever. And the kids are left to their own devices, and they figure out the way to take care of each other is this family is to be sexual. Now, where do they get that idea? That's worth exploring. But then somebody discovers it. And the system demands that one be the offender and the other be the victim. And that paradigm of victim-offender does not really fit. Sometimes it's very sexist. Sometimes the boy gets to be the offender and the girl gets to be the victim, even though the girl might be 14 months older than the boy. Okay. And I think what we need to talk about here is that these are kids for whom sexual behavior and fantasy has interfered with growth and development. It has eclipsed everything. They have all their eggs in one basket. That is the problem. I think in this country we need to move, victim offender works as a paradigm for a good number of cases. We also need to be talking about the compulsive and the vulnerable. Now, with this example of sibling incest, the one thing I want to say is that very often in these cases what will happen is that one of the two siblings will want to stop the sexual relationship. They have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, they're working outside the home, they have an extracurricular interest. They say no, and then the other sibling will not take no for an answer, and the other sibling becomes coercive. Then we need to talk about this really in two phases, of when it was compulsive behavior for both, and then when it became exploitive for one. And that you need to really use both sets of language to talk about this. Again, these kids will use, they will prefer consenting folks. That's their first choice. But if there's not another compulsive kid in your hospital, in your school, in your foster home, then they're going to pick on somebody who's vulnerable. Then they're going to pick on somebody younger, weaker, intellectually disabled, because they've just got to have it. So then they will become exploitive. And in those situations, they use more emotional coercion than physical coercion. Now, I'll give you another example from troubleshooting. Actually, this has happened several times when I've gone in after there's been sexual exploitation in a setting. And usually the perpetrator will say to me, I hear this a lot, "Hey, lady, this kid talked about being sexually abused all the time. They said they had 100 offenders. What's 101? Come on, lady, all they did is talk about being a victim. Now, if you go out on a date and someone tells you on the first date that they've been sexually abused, don't you think they're coming on to you? Don't you take that as a come on?" It's like, well, no, but that's a totally different worldview for them. They really do take this as a invitation. So what generally will happen is it'll be the unit scapegoat that will be the victim here. The one no one's going to stick up for. The one that's isolated. And that's who they'll go after, even though there may be someone younger, smaller, less intellectually endowed. They'll go after that scapegoat. And of course, that's a lot about projective identification. It's like holding a mirror up to a vampire, right? What do they see in that unit scapegoat? Unwanted parts of themselves. And they have to punish that person for having that and get a little pleasure on the side. That's a pretty good deal. You can barely do better than that, right? Get rid of something unwanted and have fun at the same time. The kinds of things that we do with this type of kid is, first of all, residential or some kind of structured setting is essential. Absolutely essential, and for two reasons. The first reason is that these kids have genuine object hunger. Despite the rotten, crappy things that have happened in their life, they still think closest to another person is desirable and possible. Now, the only way they know how to go about it is through, slap and tickle. They have to have it through sexual means or through fantasy in their own mind. But the goal is a good one, to be close to people. So individual therapy on an outpatient basis, I would say to you, can actually end up causing more harm than good. Because all you do is arouse the needs for intimacy without being able to satiate them. So we can use residential or some kind of structure here, because what they are able to do is make use of people who take care of them. One of the reasons my group from hell was the group from hell is that I did nothing for these kids in terms of their dependency needs. I did nothing. I walked in, did the group, walked out. I didn't put cereal on the table. I didn't wake them up gently in the morning. I didn't get them from point A to point B. I didn't take them to miniature golf. I did nothing. And that was really a problem. I mean, to go back to Winnicott's ideas, attachment happens through the quiet, repetitive, daily tasks of care. Kids don't become attached to us because we've taken them to Disney World. That's fun, it's expensive, but it's happened usually way before that. It happened at a much less glamorous level because we got up in the middle of the night every night, and there were no other volunteers for that when they were babies, and we did it consistently. And that's where the attachment happens. So these people are able to make use of the residential care worker who takes care of them 40 or 60 hours a week, of the teacher that teaches them something 6.5 hours a day. So they can make use of it. The other reason they need some kind of structured milieu is because they are so relentless. So if they don't have supervision, if they don't have structure, left to their own devices, it won't be good. So we need to have them in a place where we can monitor them. Getting good at something else is critical. You notice I haven't talked about therapy yet here. Okay. Getting good at something else is absolutely critical for these kids. They need mastery and competence in a different area. They need to learn there's more to life than this. So I don't care what they get good at. I don't care if it's music or computers or basketball or student government, anything but child care. They have to get mastery and competence as quickly as possible. And interestingly, the one thing, doesn't work for everybody, but the one thing I would just point you towards is cooking. And think about that. The connections between being tactile, sensual, and cooking, and maybe getting some of those needs met there. If you doubt that, just rent the foreign movie like Water for Chocolate, food and sex. And when kids get into cooking programs, they have a teacher, right? I remember one of the places I worked at, we called our cook Dad. All the kids called him Dad. And within 3 months, I was calling him Dad too. He wasn't my father. I was clear about that. They weren't. But their wish that he be their dad was a wonderful thing to have. It was a gift. That wish was so close to the surface was terrific. But, he fed us. He did lots of good things. And the kids that worked closely with Dad in the kitchen got object relations needs met through Dad. So there was a new relational template slowly but surely being formed. Kids told them they cooked good, that they liked what they cooked. So it was mastery and competence. They had identity. They had all of that kind of stuff met. And then there's the psychopharm piece, which can be kind of going back and forth between the two, more neurological issues and this, and particularly with the young man you talked about with the auditory hallucinations and OCD and everything. You'd really want to get a good regimen of psychopharm workup done on this, because there's been really good research done on this issue. Fortunately, there's two people who've done the research internationally. One of them is here in the Boston area, and it's Martin Kafka, and I really have the privilege of working with him a fair amount. One of the things I like about him is every time I send him a client, that client comes back with something different than the last person I sent him to. It's a very specifically well-designed psychopharm intervention for sexual compulsions. If he doesn't think there's any hard wiring, if he doesn't think there's a neurological base for this, or that the medication won't help them, he doesn't do it. He doesn't give medication just for the sake of it. But what medication can do, whether it's real OCD that's picked up a sexual loop as opposed to time, dirt, and money, or whether that the pleasure that the person's gotten from this has just been reinforced in the brain chemistry, the psychopharm intervention can be very helpful. What it does is it lifts them out of it long enough to take a look at it. Okay, lifts them out of it long enough to take a look at it. So let me give you an example. Young man, one of my early cases that I shared with Marty, sent him, this was a very, very big boy who had a phenomenal number of arrests for obscene phone calls and exhibitionism. And that's the times he got caught. So this is what he'd probably done was at least 10 times greater. And he lived in a world of sexual fantasy most of the time, and the fantasies were getting increasingly more violent with age. And he was one of those few people that was really kind of satiating. He'd get kind of bored with one fantasy, and he'd have to up the ante a little bit. So I sent him to Marty, and he comes back eventually with 60 milligrams of Prozac. He's a slow buildup, but because he's a big boy, he can tolerate it. That, of course, decreases his libido and changes some of the ruts that he gets in. So he said to me, he said, "Lynn, it's like I have my life back." He said, "A teacher can yell at me in school." Now, this is his perception that he's being yelled at, but it's an injury, right? A teacher can yell at me in school, and I don't immediately go into a sexual fantasy about, and I'll save you the gory details, that person. And that's where I would have stayed for like 6 or 7 hours, or sometimes days. He says, I go sideways. I think to myself, I don't care what they think anyway, or, I don't want to lose my points, I don't want to lose my weekend, so what? What's the big deal? And I don't get stuck like a hamster in a cage the way I used to. With some of these kids, if they need medicine, you can do the best talking cure in the world. And if they don't have the medicine that they need helping you and helping them, it's not going to make that much of a difference. Okay. Now, the motivation to change here is the wanting to relate to people, not in a different way, just wanting to relate to people. And it takes a very long time. These groups are open-ended. These groups, I might do them in 12-week segments, and they get a little pizza and a small sort of mini graduation for going on to the next module. But basically, we all know they're in for the long haul, and it's very slow, and it is very ego-syntonic for them right now. They have very little interest in changing. And I'm going to say something that sounds like it's a contradiction. It's ego-syntonic, yet they are generally very shame-based kids.
End of side 3. This program is continued on the other side. Side 4.
I sent him to Marty, and
Side 4.
Now, how could that possibly make sense? Let me just do a real quick thing here. Guilt is generally about behavior. I don't like my behavior. Made me look bad, hurt other people. I want to avoid the consequences of that behavior in the future. So I may have a difficult behavior, but I'm a good person with bad behavior. Guilt implies object constancy. I'm not my behavior. I can make amends, I can clean up my mess, I can go on with life. And I'll try not to do it again, but I'm okay. Shame isn't about even feeling like being a bad person with bad behavior. Shame, on the other hand, is being bad. It's your core. It's a deficit. It's in its essence. It's usually something you don't feel like you can change. You can no more change your shame and what you're ashamed of than you can change the color of your eyes or the size of your feet. It's just about being. You are the worst. You are the lowest. You are as bad as they come. And yet you're helpless and you're hopeless and you're beyond redemption. And I think this is why shame drives so much of addictive and criminal behavior. Because if you're the lowest little worm in the world, you've got nothing to lose, you can't get any worse than you already are, why not be a jerk? Why not pick up that crack vial and get a 5-minute high? What have you got to lose? Why not molest that kid and take get a couple minutes of euphoria? Why not steal that car, buzz the police station, engage the police in a very dangerous high-speed chase that you can sit in a cell and get high off of for a week? Why not? If you've got nothing to lose, there's nowhere to go but up. And so I think with a lot of kids who have this behavior, they were shame-based. They were so shamed about needs or feelings or behaviors or just their existence that they really have this kind of fatalistic attitude about who they are and what they're doing. The other thing about shame in sexual acting out is that the sexual acting out behavior can actually explain the shame. And it's a really odd dynamic that can get built up. Have you ever had free-floating anxiety? Have you ever woken up one morning with the heebie-jeebies? You just wanted to jump out of your skin. You just had ants in your pants. Okay. And I bet you looked around for why you felt that way. I bet you worked hard to figure it out. It was that 5th cup of coffee, only decaf for me now. It's that supervision session at 3 o'clock. That's why I'm feeling so anxious. I haven't changed the oil in my car in 18,000 miles. My engine's going to seize at any moment. That's why I feel this way. So you tried to rein it in. You tried to manage it. And I think with chronically shamed people or shame-based folks, they look for why they're ashamed. So they say, well, anybody who would molest a kid ought to feel as bad as I do. Anybody who would steal money from their family to get drugs or drink ought to feel like a lowly worm in the world. Now I know why I feel hopeless and helpless and beyond repair. The other thing about shame-based people is when they shame us, when they call us the racial name or the homophobic name or the sexist, misogynist name, they make fun of our physical appearance, they are teaching us what it's like to be them. And it's a backwards way at attachment. For that moment, we know what it's like to be Sean or Marie. They've taught us, again, through action, not words, or maybe words. But and so it is, I think, in many ways, their very backwards way at trying to gain some sort of attachment. Kind of brings me back to my point here about using more sun than wind. Shame-based people have a real low tolerance for confrontation of denial, of yelling and screaming and making everything, all roads lead back to the sexual offending. Now, in fact, with compulsive kids, I do think all roads do lead back to sexual offending. I think a lot of what they do in their day-to-day life does relate to their pattern, but we need to sort of find some face-saving ways of dealing with that, and particularly for teenagers, that's important. Very quick example, then I'm going to wrap up. Remember a young man in residential that was in my group, and he was doing a lot of, I would say, grooming behaviors, and a lot of it was like flipping his hair, running his tongue over his lips, and doing a lot of behaviors that drove the adults nuts and were really alienating to the kids. Could do an imitation of Mariah Carey at the drop of a hat. So it just was this big mess. So they would talk to him, that's a boundary violation. Running your tongue over your lips. That's a boundary violation. Isn't that part of your pre-assault cycle? Stop making goo-goo eyes. It just sort of went on. And the more they did it, the more he did it, right? And it was like no one was going anywhere. At the end of one of the groups, I had given the kids a Beanie Baby, and I meant it to be the seal of approval, the Beanie Baby seal, right? Well, I'm a little slow. I didn't realize I'd bought walruses. So he had complained to staff that it was really a walrus, not a seal, that he got the point about the seal of approval. It was a corny joke. And don't tell Lynn that I told you that she really brought a walrus. So now it's really important for him to be aware of his behaviors and to be changing them. But what we ended up doing is that when he started with the lips and the hair, and the staff would say, walrus. That took him back to group, took him back to what he was there for, took him back to what his pattern was, without the boundary violation, you're doing it again, stop it, the whole thing that for him was very shame-based. Okay. Now, I've talked about if they don't have a consenting partner, they become exploitive. I do want to save the predatory stuff till after you've had your meal. Let me just wrap up, because we know there's so many kids that are hurt, particularly if we include hands-off traumas. So many kids that are hurt. And really a very small number of them end up with sexual acting out problems. Very few end up with this behavior. We know that from the resiliency work. Unfortunately, the few that do have these problems, they end up keeping the rest of us very, very, very busy, right? Whole industry has built up around these folks who do transmit this intergenerationally. So, how do we account for who gets the contagion and who doesn't? How do we understand that? I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think some of it, again, goes back to object relations and picking up the introject, the dumb luck of picking up and introject that this is what good people do. Remember when I talked about the victim-offender split? You're either a victim or an offender. And you all know that what victims, many do, is they say, I'm bad, I'm guilty, I'm responsible, I'm in control of this. If only I could figure out how to stop being bad, then I'd be okay. Because really only I have control over my behavior, not anybody else's, right? And boy, what else can a child do? How many kids get a good enough start to be able to say, my parent's a good person with bad behavior? How many people get to that level of object constancy before trauma starts? A few, but not many. So most are really stuck back at the split, right? Good and bad, that's what they have available to them. They've come by it quite honestly. And what kid can say, I'm good, but my parent's bad? What worse existential despair would there be to be a good person dependent on a bad person for your food, your water, your shelter, your attention, your affection, everything wrapped up in a bad person? It's why we had capos in the death camps. It's why we had Patty Hearst fought the good fight, but eventually joined the Symbionese Liberation Army because, she had to do some fancy dancing. She was a good person dependent on bad people. Maybe her good people weren't quite so good. Maybe these bad people weren't so bad. So it's not an option. The best most kids can do is to say, I'm bad and my parent is good. There was a 14-year-old that Kevin and I worked with that taught us a lot about this. And this was in the very early days. It's 1982. We were making this up as we went along and doing the best we could and made spectacular mistakes. I still make them, but I'm going to tell you about some fairly spectacular ones today. There's a young man in our group who had been going back and forth between the victim-offender split between his birth and 10. And he was severely physically abused by a father. And so we decided we didn't understand that this kid was well defended for a reason. And we thought, if we just dealt with his victimization, he wouldn't need to be an offender anymore. And by the time he got caught, he had dozens of victims who were very little boys in his neighborhood. So I thought, we would bring this up in group. Second mistake. First one was not respecting that the boundary was there for a reason. And secondly, now I'm going to do it in a way that he's not going to be able to save face in front of his peers. So we say, I'll call him Mickey. We said, well, Mickey, we're really sorry about what your father did. That was really, that was a terrible thing for him to have beaten you like that. We're really sorry that happened. And he said to us, you don't get it. You weren't there. I was a bad kid. He would try to talk. I wouldn't listen. That was the only thing he could do, was to hit me. No, Mickey, there's nothing you could have done that would have deserved being hit. Adults should use their words, not their hands, And he says, you weren't there. You don't get it. My father did the best that he could. He's a good guy. He couldn't help it. Well, eventually we figured out there's no future in this, so we ended up shifting gears and working instead with what had gotten him into trouble, trying to give him mastery and competence in the here and now. So when we talked with him about his 40-plus offenses, what do you think he said about his victims? They were bad. They were guilty. They were responsible. They deserved it. They now carry the bad object in this split. And what do you think he said about himself as an offender? Couldn't help it. Doing the best he could. So after 2 years of treatment, he said, "Get off my back. I have a bad habit, so what?" Now, and where do you think he went at 18 years old? Did his time, picked up his dime, found his father in Florida, made a beeline for him. I think what often happens is sometimes kids get they pick up the interject, the bit or particle of the parent, that this is how good people behave. This is how good people act. Other kids feel more fear around it, they feel helplessness, they feel whatever, but you can get it under your skin that this is how good people act. Let me give you a slightly different example to close on. This is a mistake. I think it will make it a little bit more clear because it can be so dense. I was, when my daughter was about 22 months old, a few months prior to that, I had an uncle that was like a father to me, and he had died. He died of lung cancer. I was actually holding him as he died. Right after that, my cat of 14 years died. And I was severely sleep deprived. My daughter didn't sleep through till she was about 14 months old. So I was like not doing well. This was not a good period of time in my life. So I decided before I had a life, when I used to have a life, that's an interesting Freudian slip. I usually say when I used to have a life, I was an expert scuba diver. So in the midst of this depression, I decided I'm going to go down and I'm going to dive for 4 days. And Grace is going to stay, she's now 22 months, she's going to stay with her caregiver. And it was really my best effort to kind of pull myself back together. So I did that. On the 4th day, she loves the place she's at. She's there a lot. And she says to Alice, who's an older woman from northern Italy, she says, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy." And Alice says, "Mommy will be back tonight. We're going to the airport." So several hours go by, and they're in the car together. Now, to really understand this story, you have to know I'm one of the worst Boston drivers there is. I use my words, not my hands, Never had an accident, but everything is, "You fucking idiot. Where'd you get your driver's license? Here's in Roebuck. Dunkin' Donuts, people should be killed." It's things like this. And I stupidly thought I had till she was like in the 1st grade to knock this off. Okay. So in the morning, she's missing me. She's object hungry. She's yearning for the good object. Several hours later, she's in the car with Alice, who slows down for a red light. There's no danger. There's no trouble. There's just a few cars in front. She looks over the dashboard with no affect whatsoever, says, "Fuck you." For the next 2 hours, while they're like making their way up to Logan Airport, it's like, "Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you." Well, don't you know I was in terrible trouble when I got off that plane? And and what it was is when she couldn't have the good object, she would be the good object. When she couldn't have the good object, she would be the good object, because that was one of the bits and particles of me that got into her. This is what good people do. Just like with Michael, the sexual abuse, the violence, the coercion. Violence is something good people do. That's how you know the good people from the bad people. And of course, I'm like wondering, of all the bits and particles of me that could have gotten under her skin, why that? Why couldn't she have talked with her hands excessively? Why couldn't she have run her fingers through her hair? There's a lot of things she could have done instead of that. Well, I bet at 22 months old, she was worried about me. And she probably noticed that when I swore in the car, I kind of came alive. Mommy gets jump-started, and she's not so sleepy. And so I think that really took hold with her in the same way that the kinds of things that these kids experience relationally with their parents get under their skin. They see the benefits of it. They can't make sense of it. It's like picking up an electrical charge. Now, there's a happy ending to this story, which is I no longer swear in the car, and she doesn't swear anymore, and we were able to work it through. And there's lots of other dysfunctional bits and particles that have gotten picked up along the way, but at least that one is settled. What I'd like to do is to give you your break now. We'll meet back here at 1, and I'll pick up with the character pathology and some questions. Thank you very much. And do you want me to wait? Tina? Go. All right, what we're going to do is continue on the continuum here talking about character pathology. I'll pause for some questions, and then we will, we'll take our break after we talk about diagnostic assessment. The point of the diagnostic assessment section today is to give you an overview of what should be included, what's important. I think the process of learning to do a diagnostic assessment is one that's a very long one that includes practice and all that, but I'll talk a little more about that. And then after our break, I'm going to take you through some of the more popular group exercises and talk about individual and family therapy and how they fit in. And then I will close today with a story from the group from hell. So, okay, so in terms of predatory sexual behavior, we are really talking about the early stages of character pathology. And when I do trainings with Craig Latham, he uses a cartoon from the New Yorker that I like very much. He just won't lend it to me. And it has a person lying on a psychoanalyst's couch, and there's a doctor sitting behind the desk. And the doctor says to the patient, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is you have a healthy, vibrant ego. The bad news is you have absolutely no basis for reality in it. Okay? So that's sort of what these kids are like. I mean, if we have been talking largely about kids who experience some level of guilt or shame, so to some degree, you could say these kids have no shame. Now, Jim Gilligan would vigorously disagree with that and has really constructed a terrific argument in his book on violence about violent people being very shame-based. It's wonderful in terms of how it goes from the intrapsychic micro level all the way out to very large macro issues. And I've learned a lot from it. My thinking is really changing as I'm trying to integrate some of what he has had to say about unmet dependency needs being met through violence. And the end point of getting to prison. And then the kind of reaction formation. If you really have a lot of unmet dependency needs, you can go to prison for lots of different things. You could go to prison for a big drug deal and really pull a lot of time there. But his point is that if you feel like a little baby and then you kill somebody and you are a big, bad, frightening person, what better reaction formation, what better way to hide that than, it's a good way. He talks about a man he saw very much on this end of the continuum in prison for about 5 years. And they're very much into their work when the man says to him, the inmate who's killed multiple people, says, I'm a baby in a boat with no oars in the middle of an ocean. I'm an infant in a boat with no oars in the middle of an ocean. I mean, what better language to speak about unmet dependency needs. And Jim thought, what a good breakthrough, this is wonderful, this is terrific. And then the man, of course, immediately decompensated after having admitted that. So, but what better way to not look like that? And I think that the kids that I work with are not at that point yet. And there are very few of them that are going to get there. But it's a body of work that I'm really trying to integrate. At this end of the continuum, we're really talking about people who use a lot of denial and very primitive forms of projection. As we've gone along the continuum, we talked about abuse-reactive kids being not defended around victimization. The kids that are more compulsive or engage in extensive mutual sexual behavior, I didn't say, but they use more of normalization, rationalization, externalization. It's you. What's wrong with you? Is your mind in the gutter? It's only sex. If you didn't lock us all up here, this wouldn't have happened. If you would let us date, these things wouldn't go on. But the nice thing about that kind of normalizing and rationalizing and externalizing is at least you can talk about it. You have a conversation. You have a foot in the door. It's a start. It's something. These kids will, at the far end, they rely on denial and projection. And it's not even just denial about their offense. It's denial about everything. Just denial. And so if you're sitting in a living room with them, they knock something over, and you say, could you please pick that up? They say, I didn't do it. Now, a shame-based kid might say, I didn't do it. Why are you always picking on me? Tommy did that last week. You didn't ask him and what do you get paid for? You pick it up, you do it, and you get a lot of passion, and you get a lot of heat with shame. What I'm talking about is that coldness that you experience. That it's on your bibliography. There's a book by Reed Malloy, M-E-L-O-Y, called Violent Attachments. And Reed Malloy talks about adults like this, and he says we've got to quit talking about superego, moral development, and conscience. He says, people who are this psychopathic, they have an attachment disorder. That's really what it's about. They've closed up shop. They're not. They have a perfect relationship with the self. They're not interested in you or anybody else. Okay, and in fact, to make an attachment to you would risk that you might say, your breath is kind of bad today. You need to go brush your teeth, or I don't like it when you say. Or there would be some nicks in the mirror that then they become enraged over and they lash out. So that these are folks who really have an attachment disorder. So that it's interesting because when I work with the more shame-based kids, I do feel, even though they do nasty things and they yell and scream and threaten, there is some kind of connection there often. When I sit with kids that are at this far end of the continuum, I literally feel cold. My basal temperature drops in my body. And I start thinking weird things. I start thinking things like, if this person could kill me and get out of here, they would, and I wonder how long it would take them to find the body, and then no one would know where Grace was, and she'd be stuck at the school, and how long would it take people to figure that out? And I'm not afraid. I'm not the least bit worried. It's just this sort of stream of consciousness about annihilation. In the same way that I might also think, I've got a 75-cent off Tylenol coupon I better use up before it expires, and that kind of thing. And supervising a forensic eval the other day of a young woman who had a rival beat up and took pictures of it. They left her rival for dead, and she was convicted because of the pictures. And she really wanted it for memories. She literally wanted these Polaroids for her scrapbook. So she had enlisted other people into this activity, and she's snapping away. So I said to the social worker who was evaluating her, I said, what's it like to sit with her? And she says, well, it's kind of like sitting by yourself. And I said, well, bingo. There we go. So these are kids that need a whole lot of wind. And you need to be confronting that denial all the time. And it's a very particular way of working. They do better if they're in the same unit together. It's not a great idea to mix them with the other population. The obvious reason is if you mix them with the other kids are vulnerable. By virtue of the fact that the other kids have object hunger and this kid isn't so interested in true relationship, the other kids are going to be very vulnerable to the predatory offender. But the other is just the style, the way you have to work with them, what you have to do. And I can do that. I look at them and I say in exactly this tone of voice, do I look especially stupid to you or just the normal amount? Okay. But I also find it tiresome. It's not very interesting. The wear and tear is tremendous, and it's just not what I like to do. So there's certain DYS units that do a good job. There's a couple programs out west that I also like a lot. And so let's just say out west, what they would do is, you're at dinner, someone knocks something over. You say, please pick that up. They say, I didn't do it. You just watch them do it. What they do out there, they would take everybody's dinner away. They would have group. They would process it. When the person who tipped it over admits to tipping it over and cleaning it up, Everybody else gets their food back and dinner continues. So it's a sort of constant vigilance around those kinds of defenses that's needed. And it's really hard work. It's really hard work. There's very little motivation to change at this point. You're really talking about stuff it gives egocentric new meaning. These are children who are more likely to have used weapons, more likely to have used physical aggression, and more likely to have used other kids in the crime. Now, when I talk about that, we have to be careful because you may need to, if you're in foster care or residential, you may need to use a lookout. That's not necessarily enlisting another child in this sense. I'm talking about holding a victim down. I'm talking about intimidating witnesses after the fact. They have been called problems in their communities far earlier than the other kids. You know, compulsive kids have much of their yuck kind of compartmentalized into the interpersonal sphere. When I talk about this far end of the continuum, they might rip off a car, they might rip off a body. Just kind of depends on which presents itself to them first. So it's a much more premeditated, planful, and clearly without remorse. Now, one of the things that Tony Cavanaugh Johnson talks with this about in this population is a fixation on toilet training and on soiling and wetting. And I think it's a fairly dangerous concept because there's so many reasons why kids might soil and wet. They soil and wet for medical reasons, and that's where we have to start. They soil and wet because they got abused for getting up in the middle of the night. They soil and wet because of severe deprivation and neglect, and they can't afford to let anything go. So they hoard what they have. They may soil and wet because it's a fairly popular paraphilia. If you're into paraphilias, this is one of them that you hear about. So if your object of arousal of sexual arousal is non-human in nature, you might be sexually aroused to urine or feces. It's a possibility. What I'm talking about here is kids using wetting and soiling as a weapon. Okay, because with all of those other reasons I talked about, the abuse, the neglect, the paraphilia, the medical reasons, or regression in the service of the ego, going back to an earlier developmental stage. It's what happened in foster care when I did that. Kids would suddenly begin to wet in the foster home. It was because of the anxiety, but also let's keep on doing this till we get it right. With those kinds of behaviors, what you usually see then is kids who are very ashamed of what they've done, and they try to hide it, or they try to get it to the laundry before you can find it. And if you do find it and you try to talk with them, they won't look at you. It's the body language of shame, the eyes turned inward, the eyes turned towards the heart and the genitals. When I'm talking about using soiling and wetting as a weapon, I'm talking about what Reed Malloy calls the reptilian stare, which is looking through you, not at you, but through you. And with this level, the best thing of all is that you find the soiling or the wetting. You know they did it, but you can't prove it, and there isn't going to be any consequence for it. That's the greatest thrill of all. Let me give you a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about one young man, because this was like another spectacular treatment error, who was in a group I was running in a detention center. And everybody else in this group kind of hovered right around, kind of like here to here, okay? And we were doing corrective reparenting, and they were using the group as a good enough family, and I was the mother, the grandmother, the aunt, the whatever. And then we had one kid who I'll call Tom, who was firmly planted over there at the far end. And he essentially had an enormous impact on the group, to say the least. So things would happen, like a new kid would come into the program, and the way we would work it is that everybody would go around and talk about their offenses, and then it would be the new kid's turn. Now you can imagine the silence that would lead into the new person's disclosure. And that's okay. You just sit and you wait and you get through it. And sometimes to fill the airspace, some of the kids would say, well, I just looked at Rob's sneaker when I had to do this the first time. So Rob, why don't you put your sneaker right in the middle of the room where he's looking? And, that might help him. And, the kids are usually pretty hopeful about this, reassuring the new kid they're not going to think less of them. If you can do this, you can do anything. Well, Tom could go, excuse me, let me tell my offenses in greater detail, and then that'll help this new kid get going. And I would look right at him, and I would say, no. And then the other kids, of course, with the projection, right, rush to his defense. What's wrong with you? You're telling us to be honest. You're telling us to be open. He's trying to be helpful. He's volunteering. How come you're not going to let him do this? And so I would talk to them and say things like, well, because as far as I can tell, Tom becomes sexually aroused when he talks about his offenses, and I don't think that's a very good idea. And actually, I think he's trying to be top kitty in the group, that he's trying to intimidate you with how many he has and how bad they are. And he's there, and I'm talking about him like he's not there, right? So this is like not working. So the kids look at me, and they're used to me as a mother, a grandmother, an older sister. And one kid actually said to me, what is this PMS stuff they talk about? It was such a departure for them. And when I say things to somebody else, like, do I look especially stupid to you or just the normal amount? They wonder, like, when is it going to be my turn? When is she going to turn on me? So the mixing between the confrontation and the kind of more supportive work, which is still about holding people accountable, it just doesn't work. Okay, so one day we're in group, and one of the kids that's in the group has been badly neglected, terrible hygiene, and it's going to take him a while to learn. So there's always a stench in the group room, always a terrible stench. And we assume, adults and kids, that it's this kid who's been so neglected. And one day, that kid who's been so neglected has jumped off a fire escape and run away, jumped the wall. So we go to group, and the stench is still there. So I think everybody starts to back up and re-examine their sort of assumptions here. Finally, in the middle of the group, one of the kids turns to Tom and says, Jesus, your feet stink. Now, what would your normal 16-year-old say to something like that in a detention center? Fuck you. Yeah, fuck you, or it's because I've been with your mother, or something like that. There'd be some sort of snap back to that. Tom picks up his sock, his foot, his socked foot, smells it, and starts cackling. And we had actually confiscated some Jeffrey Dahmer scrapbooks from Tom. So he loved Jeffrey Dahmer, loved him. And it was that kind of cackle that the neighbors had complained about before they got to the smell in Milwaukee, the sort of constant laughing. So I was like, what is going on? So I talked to floor staff, and sure enough, a couple days before, they had found in his room, stashed away, small plastic bags, waste paper basket liners, that had been filled with gym socks, urinated into, then tied up. And he was wearing those. That's what the stench in the group room had been. So he... and one child care worker, out of the goodness of his heart, had gone down to Bradley's on his own time with his own money, bought Tom new gym socks. So, and he'd gotten consequences, and he'd had to do his laundry, and he was still at it. Now, part of me wonders if this was partially a paraphilia. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that I think it was a weapon for him to use against us and against all other people. And he had this sort of fascination. Well, that for me was it. I'd had it at that point. That was enough. So I wanted him out. I was going to cash in some chips and send him out west. And I thought, I really don't like this kid. In fact, I hate this kid. And this kid has really wrecked the group for all of us. So I'm really worried that maybe I just want to get rid of him because I don't like him, and because it'll be really convenient for me to have him gone. So I asked for a forensic psychiatrist to come in and do an eval. So the person calls me back and he says, yeah, I think he should go out to Northwest Passage. That'd probably be pretty helpful for him. He said, I just thought you'd want to know this. He said, I asked him about the sex offender group he's in. He says, yeah, he's been in something, maybe 8 months, which was accurate. And he says, yeah, it was run by a woman. Couldn't remember her name. Thought it began with an E. My name's Lynn. Thought it began with an E, but he was absolutely positive she'd been on the Oprah show. And that's because, he didn't care enough to hate me. Couldn't be bothered. That would have been an attachment, to remember my name, to get me back someday. Because I was always pulling his points, taking stuff away from him. He couldn't even, he didn't even care enough. But he's such a special guy, he deserved nothing less than a group therapist who's done Oprah. So this is really a very much an uphill battle. He didn't make it to Northwest Passage. He got somewhere else. And he left after a year, picked up his, did his time, picked up his dime, came back, and he came back to Massachusetts, did a lot of terrible things. Fast forward maybe 4 years now, and I'm doing some supervision with a brand new social worker in a jail. And he says to me, tell me what, I have this thing that's really upsetting for me. He says, I see an inmate, and I have to look at him like this, with like one eye. I only look at his right eye, because he bores through me. He's got these really intense eyes, and I can't look at him in the eye. And guess who it was? Tom, yeah, who was there for sexual assaults. I hate that when you hear about, younger kids, and you've had this experience too that you've worked with, and then later as adults they're a headline in the Herald or something like that. Okay, so this takes a lot of external motivation, takes a lot of actual secure treatment, so that they generally will do well they're going to do better in a locked setting, and something that's extremely structured, and that you really work with them over time to begin to internalize some of the structure. But this is the group for whom I really feel the least amount of hope. I mean, Tom's probably exactly where he needs to be for now. So we'll see what happens, but okay. Questions or comments before we move into diagnostic assessments? And again, you're going to have to move up to the mic, and if people can really speak into the mic. Yeah, go ahead.
What would you say is the incidence of dissociation amongst this more extreme group, and what are therefore the implications for treatment? And also, I suppose, the criminal justice side of things as well.
The dissociation in the people at this end?
Yes.
My personal opinion, and I don't have research to back this up, but my opinion, next to nothing, practically zero. And I think that some of the dissociative identity disorders that have been offered at this level of torture and predatory kind of behavior are malingering. And there's actually, I don't have the research, but you can talk to Park Dietz, you can talk to Reed Malloy, people who do that kind of work more with adults, and they'll tell you. I'll tell you why. We dissociate from what is overwhelming for us. We dissociate from what is unpleasant, what is so toxic. This feels good to them. And it's not something we like to talk about in America, about the level of pleasure that people who do the hurting get from the hurting. The victims aren't getting it, but the offender is. So it makes no sense to me that one would dissociate from something that met so many needs on so many levels and was biologically rewarding for them.
Just being more an integrated behavior.
Yes, it's planful, it's integrated, it involves a lot of ego functioning as opposed to fragmentation.
So I guess one of the questions that I have is about the etiology of this type of pathology, because you would assume that one would have had a very early and very severe history of abuse.
Great, it's a great question. I would again refer you primarily to Reed Malloy's work, and particularly in violent attachments. The few cases that I've had any long-term involvement with, I do see a pattern, and I think that, obviously these folks were born with object hunger. They weren't aberrant in that way. But I think that often what happened is they lost the object they yearned for, and then the clincher was someone else came along and said, "You are fine, fine, fine." They really did not have a lot of optimal frustration. They didn't have natural consequences for their behavior. People made excuses. If it weren't for your mom leaving, if it weren't for this, if it weren't for that, then you wouldn't be the way you are. So it really doesn't count. It's not your fault. So people talk about, to some degree, lower levels of the hands-on abuses, of physical and sexual abuse, but we have not defined neglect well enough. So how do you, and what happens, like in the FBI behavioral science statistics, they put it all together. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. And I think that it's been this neglect of optimal frustration, of natural consequences, of being told, really, that you're perfect in every way. I mean, these folks have come by this honestly. That Ted Bundy would be one example. Someone who was, from the best of records and everybody being interviewed, was not physically or sexually abused. He talks about, he says this isn't the whole story, but one of the things that happened for Ted Bundy is, as a young guy, he he was doing breaking and enterings, but he was also going through a lot of people's garbage. And he'd find true crime detective magazines from the 50s. Those often had women who had been sexually assaulted, dismembered. I mean, these were really gory kinds of things. And he was aroused by them. And it became a very secretive kind of fantasy life for him. And he says, that's not the whole story, but he said he knows that's where he got the start for it. Yeah. So we don't want to always be looking, I mean, we need to ask, but not persistently look for severe forms of physical and sexual abuse, because I think sometimes the trauma is too much yes. It's a neglect. Okay, others? Yeah, I'll repeat your question.
I could talk loud.
Okay.
Harris noted something that you noted. He worked with, in his book on borderlines and narcissistic personality. He concluded with psychopaths that they were really untreatable because, in the end, the more you brought them out of the narcissistic syndrome, the more anxious they got, because that wasn't there by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And so he stopped treating them because they would get so anxious they wouldn't be able to function.
Yeah. Well, and I think people who are really interested in this should look at Jim Gilligan's book, because I think that with the earlier models, it really did look at it totally as an intrapsychic state, the way you're talking about the being brought out of the anxiety. And I think the more we can understand how we as a culture and how we as communities contribute to some of this, I think maybe we'll have a tiny bit more hope. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Oh, do you have a question? Or you just... Oh, I'm sorry, they're changing the... Okay. Okay. Let's move on to diagnostic assessment. And again, the point here is to talk about... to try to make you be good consumers, help you be good consumers of diagnostic assessments, rather than that you will yourselves want to go spend a lot of time doing this. Okay.
End of side 4. This program is continued on the next tape.